The humid air hung thick as molasses over Grafton that August night in 1964, clinging to everything like a damp shroud. Robert Cochran pulled his sweat-soaked shirt away from his chest as he walked the familiar route from the Grafton Sentinel newsroom to his small apartment on Maple Street. The streetlights cast sickly yellow pools along Main Street, but once he turned toward the river path, his usual shortcut home, the darkness swallowed him whole. The silence was wrong. That was the first thing that struck him as his worn leather shoes crunched on the gravel path that ran parallel to the Tygart Valley River. Usually, this time of night brought a symphony of crickets, the distant hoot of owls, the gentle murmur of water moving over stones. Tonight, the world had gone mute, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Bob had just finished typing up a small piece for tomorrow's edition. 3 paragraphs buried on page 4 about the recent string of disappearances along the railroad tracks. Nothing sensational, just the facts. 3 men missing in the past month. All railroad workers. All last seen near the riverside switching yards after their evening shifts. The police had no leads, and Chief Morrison had been tight-lipped when Bob pressed him for details. Probably just drifters moving on, Morrison had said, but his eyes hadn't met Bob's when he said it. The smell of wet stone and river mud filled Bob's nostrils as he followed the winding path. The Tygart moved sluggishly in the summer heat, its surface black as motor oil under the sliver of moon. To his left, the abandoned switching shed loomed like a tombstone against the sky, its windows dark and broken. The Baltimore and Ohio tracks stretched into the distance, steel rails gleaming faintly in the starlight. His footsteps echoed strangely in the stillness, each crunch of gravel seeming to bounce off invisible walls and return to him distorted. Bob paused, listening, then shook his head and continued walking. He was letting his imagination run wild, probably because of all the strange stories that had crossed his desk lately. Just that morning, old Henry Kowalski had shuffled into the newsroom, his weathered hands clutching a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. Henry worked the night shift at the rail yard and had for 30 years. He'd seen everything the Tygart Valley had to offer, or so Bob had thought. "There's something out there, Bob," Henry had whispered, glancing around the empty newsroom as if afraid of being overheard. "Something big, white as bone and tall as a freight car. I seen it 3 times now, always around midnight, always near the water." Bob had leaned forward, his reporter's instincts kicking in despite the bizarre nature of the claim. "What exactly did you see, Henry?" "It don't have no head," Henry had said, his voice dropping even lower. "Just shoulders broad as a barn door, and arms that hang down past where its knees should be. Covered in white hair, all matted and wet-looking. Makes this sound when it breathes, like a bellows working, heavy and wet." Bob had taken notes, of course. That was his job. But even as he wrote down Henry's words, he felt the familiar skepticism creeping in. Henry was past retirement age, worked nights in all kinds of weather, probably saw shadows and made them into monsters. But then Martha Hensley had come in that afternoon, her usually perfect hair disheveled, her hands shaking as she clutched her purse. Martha ran the boarding house on River Street and wasn't given to flights of fancy. "My nephew Danny saw it," she'd said without preamble, settling her considerable bulk into the chair across from Bob's desk. "2 nights ago, walking home from his girlfriend's place. Said it was standing in the shallows near the old trestle bridge, just standing there like it was waiting for something." "What did it look like?" Bob had asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. "Tall, real tall, and white all over like it was covered in fur or hair. But the strangest thing, Danny swears it didn't have no head, just shoulders and a body that went up to nothing." Bob had nodded, scribbling notes, but his editor's words from earlier that week echoed in his mind. "Bob, I don't want any tabloid nonsense in my paper," Pete Sullivan had said when Bob first mentioned the strange sightings. "People are scared enough with these disappearances. Don't go adding fuel to the fire with ghost stories." But were they ghost stories? Bob had spent his lunch break at the Grafton Public Library, digging through old newspapers and local records. What he'd found had made his coffee grow cold in the cup. References to something stalking the riverside went back decades. A 1934 article in the Charleston Gazette mentioned a creature of unusual size and description, terrorizing railroad workers near Grafton. The piece was buried in the back pages, written in the dismissive tone newspapers used for stories they didn't quite believe but couldn't entirely ignore. More intriguing were the Civilian Conservation Corps logs from the 1930s. The CCC had maintained a camp just outside Grafton, and their daily reports were meticulous in their record-keeping. Bob had found several entries that made his skin crawl. July 15, 1936, work crew reported unusual sounds near the river after dark. Investigation found large tracks in the mud, unlike any known animal. Crew foreman suggests posting guards during night shifts. August 3, 1936, Henderson and Murphy claim to have seen a gargantuan beast near the trestle bridge. Description matches previous reports of a large, pale, headless figure. Both men are reliable workers and do not drink. August 20, 1936, project supervisor recommends relocating camp to higher ground. Continued reports of the creature have affected worker morale. 3 men have requested transfers. The records stopped abruptly after that date. Bob had searched for more information but found nothing. It was as if whatever had been stalking the riverside in the 1930s had simply vanished, or had been deliberately covered up. Now, walking alone in the suffocating darkness, Bob found himself wishing he'd taken the long way home. The river path had seemed like a good idea during the day, a peaceful shortcut that shaved 10 minutes off his walk. But something about the quality of the silence made his journalist's instincts scream that he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. The gravel crunched under his feet with each step, a sound that seemed far too loud in the unnatural quiet. Bob's flashlight cut a weak beam through the humid air, illuminating maybe 6 feet ahead of him. Beyond that pale circle, the world was black ink. The batteries were getting weak. The light flickered occasionally, threatening to abandon him entirely. He passed the old switching shed, its broken windows like dead eyes staring out at the river. The building had been abandoned since the rail yard downsized in the early 50s, but tonight it seemed to loom over him with malevolent presence. Bob quickened his pace, eager to put the crumbling structure behind him. That was when he heard the breathing. At first, he thought it was his own heartbeat thundering in his ears, amplified by fear and the strange acoustics of the river valley. But as he stopped walking, his own breathing returning to normal, the sound continued. Deep, labored inhalations and exhalations, like something massive struggling to draw air into its lungs. The sound came from ahead of him, somewhere near the bend in the path where the river curved toward the old trestle bridge. Bob's hand tightened on his flashlight. The smart thing would be to turn around, go back to Main Street, take the long way home through the well-lit residential streets. But 30 years of journalism had trained him to investigate the unusual, to seek out the truth behind the rumors. And besides, it was probably just a lost cow or maybe a deer drinking at the water's edge. He moved forward slowly, trying to keep his footsteps quiet on the loose gravel. The breathing grew louder as he approached the bend, a wet, rattling sound that made his skin crawl. Whatever was making that noise was big, bigger than any deer he'd ever encountered. Bob rounded the bend in the path, and his world collapsed into nightmare. The creature stood in the shallows of the Tygart, 30 feet away, its massive form clearly visible in the moonlight. Henry Kowalski hadn't been lying, hadn't been seeing things. If anything, his description had failed to capture the true horror of what now faced Bob in the silver-tinged darkness. The thing was enormous, at least 8 feet tall and impossibly broad across the shoulders. Its entire body was covered in coarse white hair that hung in matted clumps, dripping with river water and something else that glistened darkly in the pale light. The hair was longest around what should have been its neck, creating a shaggy collar that ended in nothing. No head, no face, no eyes to meet. Just a grotesque termination where the creature's neck should have connected to a skull. But somehow, impossibly, it was aware of its surroundings. As Bob stood frozen on the path, the thing turned toward him with fluid grace that defied its massive bulk. Though it had no visible eyes, Bob could feel its attention focus on him with laser intensity. The breathing grew louder, more agitated, filling the air with a sound like a steam engine building pressure. The creature's arms hung past its knees, ending in hands that looked more like twisted branches than human appendages. Each finger was easily a foot long, ending in what appeared to be blackened claws that scraped against its own legs as it moved. Its torso was grotesquely muscular, the white hair failing to hide the bulging masses of tissue underneath. Its legs were like tree trunks, planted firmly in the muddy riverbank. Bob tried to back away slowly, but his foot caught on a loose stone and sent it skittering across the gravel. The sound rang out like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. The creature's breathing stopped entirely, and for a moment the world was completely still. Then it began to move toward him. The thing didn't walk so much as flow across the uneven ground, its massive form seeming to glide despite the thunderous impact of each footstep. The ground trembled under Bob's feet as the creature approached, and he could hear small stones splashing into the river as they were shaken loose from the embankment. Bob's paralysis broke. He turned and ran, his flashlight beam dancing wildly as he sprinted back along the gravel path. Behind him, the footsteps grew faster, closer, each impact seeming to shake the earth like a minor earthquake. The creature's breathing had resumed, but now it sounded different, hungrier, more excited, like a predator that had finally spotted its prey. The abandoned switching shed flew past on Bob's left, but he didn't dare look back to see how close his pursuer had come. His lungs burned in the humid air, and sweat poured down his face despite the relative coolness of the night. His reporter's notebook bounced in his shirt pocket, and somewhere in the back of his terrified mind, he found himself cataloging details. The sound of the creature's breathing, the way it moved, the impossible reality of what he was witnessing. Ahead, the path curved back toward the main road, but Bob could see that he wasn't going to make it. The creature was gaining on him with each stride, and he could feel the vibrations of its approach growing stronger. In desperation, he veered off the path toward the steep embankment that led up to the road above. The slope was treacherous, covered in loose shale and scrubby vegetation that offered little purchase. Bob scrambled up on his hands and knees, his flashlight finally failing entirely and plunging him into near-total darkness. Behind him, he heard the creature reach the bottom of the embankment, its breathing now so close that he could feel the warmth of its exhalations on the back of his neck. Rocks and dirt cascaded down the slope as Bob clawed his way upward. His hands were scraped raw, and his knees were bleeding through his trousers, but terror gave him strength beyond his normal capabilities. He could hear the creature trying to follow him up the slope, its massive weight causing small landslides with each movement. Halfway up the embankment, Bob's hand closed around a sturdy root. He used it to pull himself higher, then grabbed another and another. The crown of the slope was only 20 feet above him now, the faint glow of the distant streetlights marking his goal. Behind him, the creature's frustrated breathing filled the air, punctuated by what sounded almost like growls of annoyance. Bob's fingers closed over the edge of the embankment, and he hauled himself over onto the blessed asphalt of the road. He rolled away from the edge and lay gasping on the warm pavement, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. For a moment, all he could hear was the pounding of his own heart and the whistle of air through his tortured lungs. Then, from the darkness below, came a sound that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. It started as a low moan, rising in pitch and volume until it became something between a roar and a wail. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off the surrounding hills and rolling across the water like thunder. It spoke of rage and hunger and something else, something that might have been loneliness or despair. The cry faded slowly, leaving only the normal sounds of a summer night. Crickets began to chirp hesitantly, as if they too had been waiting for the creature to depart. In the distance, Bob could hear a truck rumbling along the main highway, the sound wonderfully normal and human. He forced himself to his feet, swaying slightly as the adrenaline began to wear off. His clothes were torn and filthy, his hands and knees bleeding from his desperate climb. His flashlight was gone, dropped somewhere during his flight, and his reporter's notebook was the only thing that had survived the encounter intact. Bob limped toward town, staying on the road and as far from the river as possible. Each step sent sharp pains through his scraped knees, but he welcomed the discomfort. It proved that he was still alive, still human, still sane despite what he had witnessed. The streets of Grafton were empty at this hour, the houses dark except for the occasional porch light. Bob passed the Methodist church, its white steeple pale against the star-filled sky. The sight of the cross atop the steeple brought him an odd comfort, though he wasn't particularly religious. There was something reassuring about symbols of human faith and hope after encountering something so utterly alien. His apartment building came into view, a modest two-story structure that had never looked more welcoming. Bob fumbled for his keys with shaking hands, dropping them twice before managing to unlock the front door. The lobby was dimly lit by a single overhead bulb, but even that weak illumination felt like blazing sunshine after the darkness by the river. In his apartment, Bob went straight to the bathroom and examined himself in the mirror. His face was pale and drawn, with scratches on his cheeks from branches during his climb. His shirt was torn in several places, and there was mud caked in his hair. But his eyes were what disturbed him most. They held a haunted quality that he'd seen before in combat veterans and crime victims, the look of someone who had witnessed something that fundamentally changed their understanding of the world. He cleaned his wounds mechanically, his mind already trying to process what had happened. The journalist in him wanted to start writing immediately, to get the story down while the details were fresh in his memory. But another part of him, a deeper, more primitive part, wanted nothing more than to pretend the encounter had never happened. Bob pulled his reporter's notebook from his pocket and stared at it for a long moment. The cover was smudged with dirt and slightly damp from his sweat, but the pages inside were intact. Here was his professional obligation, to record the truth, no matter how bizarre or unbelievable. But who would believe such a story? Who would take seriously a report about a headless white giant stalking the banks of the Tygart Valley River? He thought about Henry Kowalski's frightened whispers, Martha Hensley's shaking hands. They had tried to tell him, had tried to warn him. The old CCC records had tried to warn him too, in their dry, bureaucratic language. But he had approached it all with the detachment of a professional skeptic, treating their fears as curiosities rather than genuine threats. Now he knew better. The creature was real and it was still out there. Those 3 missing railroad workers hadn't moved on to other jobs or other towns. They had encountered the same thing Bob had faced tonight, but they hadn't been lucky enough to escape. Bob sat at his small kitchen table and opened the notebook to a fresh page. His hand trembled slightly as he began to write, but his training took over, and the words flowed in clear, precise sentences. August 15, 1964. Approximately 11:45 p.m. Personal encounter with unidentified creature near Tygart Valley River. Entity appeared to match previous descriptions provided by local witnesses. Creature estimated at 8+ feet in height, covered in white hair, lacking visible head or facial features. Demonstrated awareness of surroundings despite absence of apparent sensory organs. Showed aggressive behavior when disturbed. Capable of rapid movement despite massive size. He paused, staring at the words he had just written. They looked absurd on the page, like something from a dime novel or a cheap monster magazine. But they were true, every impossible word of them. Bob continued writing, documenting every detail he could remember. The sound of the creature's breathing, the way it moved, the texture of its hair, the length of its claws. He described his flight up the embankment, the creature's frustrated roar, the unnatural silence that had preceded the encounter. Page after page filled with his careful handwriting, creating a record that he knew might be the most important story he would ever write. When he finished, dawn was breaking over Grafton, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. Bob closed the notebook and rubbed his eyes, exhausted but too wired to sleep. He made coffee with shaking hands and sat by his kitchen window, watching the town wake up. People were already moving along the streets below. Early commuters heading to work, children playing in their yards, the comfortable rhythms of normal life continuing as if nothing had changed. But something had changed, at least for Bob. He had looked into the face of something that shouldn't exist, had felt the ground shake under its footsteps, had heard its alien cry echoing through the darkness. The comfortable assumptions of his rational, modern world had been shattered in the space of a few terrifying minutes. The phone rang, making him jump. It was Pete Sullivan, his editor, calling to check on the morning edition. "Bob? You sound strange. Everything all right?" Bob stared out the window at the peaceful morning scene, then down at his notebook full of impossible testimony. "Pete, I need to talk to you. There's something happening here. Something we need to warn people about." "What kind of something?" Bob closed his eyes, knowing how the next words would sound. "The creature the railroad workers have been talking about. It's real, Pete. I saw it last night." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Pete spoke again, his voice was carefully controlled, the tone he used when dealing with difficult sources or unreliable witnesses. "Bob, you've been working too hard. Maybe you should take a few days off. Get some rest." "I'm not crazy, Pete. I know how it sounds, but I'm not making this up. 3 men are missing, and there's going to be more unless we do something. We'll talk about it when you come in. But Bob, don't write anything about this until we've had a chance to discuss it. Okay?" The line went dead. Bob set the phone down and looked at his notebook again. Pete wouldn't believe him, just as most people wouldn't believe him. But some would, people like Henry Kowalski and Martha Hensley, people who had glimpsed the truth and been dismissed as fanciful or delusional. Bob made his decision. He would tell his story, whether the Grafton Sentinel printed it or not. He would warn people to stay away from the river after dark, would urge the police to take the disappearances seriously. Some would listen, and maybe that would be enough to prevent more tragedies. He opened the notebook again and began to write a new entry, this one addressed not to himself but to anyone who might read his account. "To whoever finds this record, the creature that stalks the banks of the Tygart Valley River is real. It is dangerous beyond imagination, and it is still out there. I have seen it with my own eyes, felt the ground shake under its footsteps, heard its breathing in the darkness. 3 men have already disappeared, and there will be more unless people are warned." Bob paused, then added one final line. "I am Robert Cochran, senior reporter for the Grafton Sentinel. I stake my professional reputation on the truth of what I have written here. The monster is real, and it is waiting in the darkness by the water." He closed the notebook and placed it in his desk drawer, next to his will and other important documents. Whether anyone would ever read it or believe it remained to be seen. But at least the truth would be preserved, a testament to what had happened on that humid August night when the impossible had emerged from the shadows to terrorize a small West Virginia town. Outside his window, Grafton continued its peaceful morning routine, unaware that something ancient and hungry was sleeping in the darkness beneath the Tygart Valley River, waiting for night to fall again. Bob Cochran would spend the rest of his life trying to warn others, but few would listen. The creature would claim more victims in the years to come, always careful to space its hunts so that no pattern would emerge, always retreating to the shadows before too many questions could be asked. But on that August morning in 1964, as he sat bruised and shaken in his small apartment, Bob Cochran knew one thing with absolute certainty. He had looked into the face of something that should not exist, and it had looked back at him with an intelligence older than human civilization. The Grafton monster was real, and it was still hunting.